What's up, everyone? Splice Night here on day 300 and something of the pandemic at this point. It's been over a year. It's just the end of March. It's almost April. And obviously, people are going crazy. I'm in Canada, and in Ontario specifically, where we're experiencing a pretty bad third wave, and it's going to go exponential in the next little bit. But I wanted to talk kind of quickly about the nature of human psychology and the way we don't really deal with problems well if they don't happen in our face in such a way that we can visually recognize. And you can actually see this in a variety of different things. And it's actually kind of something I want to talk to at length at a different time, maybe, where I have more like exact research I can kind of point to. And saying this indicates this, and this indicates this, and this indicates this. But to give you kind of an overall, overarching kind of idea of what I'm talking about, there's the idea, for example, the big thing that everybody talks about, climate change. And what that really means is global climate shift, because as climate zones get hotter on a global scale, general average climate temperature of the globe going up by X degrees. What this means is that individual regions are going up, some are going down in specific areas, but the majority are going up, and that's where you get your average rise. And that has different effects, which leads to different domino impacts. Um, then you have the pollution crisis, right, which ties into climate change. And then you have specifically the plastic crisis, which is where, for example, just as a general statistic that I've seen a few times in different scientific articles, we're eating about a credit card's worth of plastic every week, which is kind of insane if you think about it. And this is like if we're not interacting with a lot of plastic heavy materials. Like this is just in our drinking water. It's actually ridiculous. And like this isn't like fluoride in the drinking water. This has to do with microplastic, and that's why it's stuff we don't even see. And like you see people, for example, take apart shrimp as a really mild example, but there's tons of microplastic in their bodies, which normally to eat them, I think the idea is that we take that out so that we aren't being interfaced with microplastic shrimp problems. But there are many fish and animals that we do interact with on a daily basis where the concentration impacts, if you've ever looked at a food chain or a food web or a food map, they talk about how concentration of plastic gets worse. You also look at obviously the giant Pacific garbage patch, and the fact that there's more than one, and how all the currents work and all that sort of thing to create the garbage patch. And so these are just two of the issues. Then you have the population sort of fluctuations that are going on. A good example, I think it was Polymatter that recently did a video on how China's one-child policy ended up leaving them with a very interesting population demographic where they don't have a lot of younger individuals, and they do have a lot of people who are aging. And this is where you get a lot of the discussion about the aging population and the fact that the actual people who are working, who are making the money, aren't actually going to be able to support the people who are all retiring and are then not contributing to the economy and are then dependent on the systems. And that might actually be part of the reason we're seeing a shift in a global scale, to kind of tangent again, to a more socialist sort of mindset, because obviously the younger generation, the millennials, the Gen Zs, and everything across the globe are getting kind of screwed with a lot of the things that are going on and the things that we're kind of having to, by nature of it's impacting us directly now, we're having to think about how do we deal with this problem. But you look at the information like the aging population, and you start to realize that the people in power are starting to realize, oh shit, I could be in a home in 10, 15 years because I'm no longer able to have that level of agency. And you start to realize that a lot of these systems are broken and have been for a long time, and they don't have people who have an active interest in changing it, because the people who have been screwing them over for the last 20, 30 years that they've been growing up have are primarily the people who are going into these positions. So there's actually a sociological tendency towards almost like a spite that is actually creating divides. You'll see this if you see like the okay boomer trend that happened a while ago, as well as like the weird sycophantic attitudes of millennials versus Gen Z or Zoomers. and how that whole thing was like a subsection of each of these groups were kind of at each other's throats for honestly kind of stupid reasons. And a lot of the generalizations were kind of targeting different generations or parts or portions of the generation, and it was also a lot of overgeneralization. Um, but then, of course, you have other stuff. So what have I covered so far? I've talked about the population problem. I've talked about the pollution with plastic, which as now in the last year or so, they've actually come out with information that says it's showing up in our placentas, which means it's creating people who are going to have plastic defects in their bodies as they grow as children, which could actually make humans over time impotent, which means we could actually axe our entire population if we don't burn ourselves out literally with the climate before then. Then there's also the growing class struggle that's kind of proliferating like crazy. And these are all interconnected problems that everybody's like, oh, this is so bad. And then you talk about social media and how that is sort of polarizing everyone and creating their own unique microcosm universe where everything is agreeing with them or everything is against them or everything is this. And it just keeps getting worse, and they're all feeding off of each other and creating their own problems. And people, so basically, to kind of summarize everything I've been saying for like the last 6.5 minutes, I want to tell you about the fact that human beings are, as I've said before, they react slow. They're able to, because we have the miracles of science and information and being able to run tests and understand what we're looking at, we're able to project out. And then you have problems of the polarizing idea where, for example, on the climate issue, you have people who say that climate change is going to lead to the apocalypse in 12 years, which is sort of accurate, but it's a little misleading the way that it's often presented. Then you also have the fact that a lot of people who are very pro-climate, fixing the issue specifically, you have a lot of hypocrisy that is ranked throughout that particular social dynamic where, for example, the idea of going vegan is probably one of the most direct individual impacts that you can have. But then you think about, I love my cheeseburger. And the idea of doing this actual thing that can have a direct, significant impact as being really annoying and inconvenient. And that's the problem. When you look at all these problems, it requires direct aggressive action. And we're not taking direct aggressive action, and we probably won't. I mean, you look at stuff like Biden, right? And everybody, you see the headlines given to that guy, and you see it's super, super hyper positive headlines, but you look at the details and you realize, for example, him forgiving $1 billion of student debt, then you realize it's less than 1% of the actual student debt. And you realize, like, I'm considered by people around me and by the internet to be relatively progressive in my ideas. And again, I'm Canada. I would vote for the NDP, which is probably a further left wing party than any like American would probably vote for it, to be honest. Not to be critical of that whole dichotomy, which is not even entirely your fault. But you kind of have this interesting dynamic where you have to realize that there are faults in both sides of the problem. And it's not a both sides thing. There's so much nuance to the problem that if you don't have everybody closer to the same page, you're going to have conflicts that will end up iterating out even as you try to solve the problem. And like, it's so easy to say that Trump was a sociopath bad guy, and he definitely was a problem, and he continually showed that. And his response to the coronavirus was a clear example of why we can't have people like that in power. But then you have people like Biden, who is no real different, in my mind, in some aspects, to how O'Toole says we have to at least acknowledge that climate change is real on our policy, and he gets fucking outvoted. There's a certain level of we have to all come together, and you've seen the messaging across, especially if you're in kind of the left-wing social media sphere, you'll see a lot of that messaging being highly prevalent as we have to all come together. And there is a certain level of manipulating the psychological tendency for human beings to require a specific enemy. And Trump served fantastic for that because he ended up waking people up to, oh shit, if we have a sociopath in charge, which, I mean, to be fair, either party is kind of a sociopath. But when you have somebody who sees the strings that have been slowly degrading over the years and decides, I want to use that, I want to take advantage of that, I want to manipulate the fact that the fabric of democracy is actually super weak, so that when these strings get pulled, you realize that there's no safety net underneath you. And that's a real problem. And that's just my thoughts on the fact that everything, as much as everybody says there's this crisis, and there's this crisis, and there's that crisis, and there's this crisis, it's a question of their interconnectability, their intersectionality in a way, right? Which is something you'll hear a lot in the LGBTQ2 plus community. Sorry, it's a really hard acronym to remember everything about. And I don't mean that as like a negative, like that's bad. It's just there is a huge amount of nuance to that whole community, right? And that's where you get this idea of you have to make sure that your messaging is a little easier to swallow, because that way it makes it easier for people to understand and empathize and appreciate and realize that, okay, so solving the plastic problem helps with the pollution problem, helps with the global warming problem, means that we're not going to hit our domino effect, or we're going to at least slow the timeline so that we don't hit it in the next 10 years or whatever. And then you have the thunder in the Arctic, which is a whole interesting thing, which sounds cool, but is actually really, really scary because it's something that propagated thousands of years ago when the Arctic was much warmer. Anyway, in summary, this has been a lot of rambling, and I'm sorry if I'm talking really quickly. I haven't really been on YouTube, and I haven't really had this opportunity to really just talk my thoughts out. I've been doing a lot more fun cartoon content previously, and this is just me kind of venting and letting my thoughts out as I watch the world turn, and trying not to think about the way that it feels like if we don't make any actions the next year. The sociological trend will probably go where I think it is, and that we won't really make any real changes for the next 5 to 10 years, because every time policy goes through, it takes 2 to 3 years for it to actually start to be enacted, and then it takes forever for us to actually see an impact. And even then, we have to wait for adoption to be the right setup. So anyway, that's just my thoughts and how I'm kind of coping with the fact that it feels like the world's blowing up, even though really it's been kind of heading that way for a long time, and everybody's just kind of been ignoring it or talking about it in a way that hasn't led to any real action, except for like a few people who have been taking some degree of action. The ocean cleanup or 4Ocean projects are a great example of the plastic pollution problem being dealt with in a way. But anyway, that's just my thoughts. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you know all the social shit that I'm going to ask you to do, like, favorites, share, all that crap, even though it's just part of the algorithm, which kind of loops you into your own social bubble. I know it's crazy to think about. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you all later. Splice out.